Hello fellow captains, and welcome back to another Captain's Academy episode with your instructor Chase. And today I'm going to be talking about captains and captain builds. Although instead of going over individual skills like I've done in the past, this particular episode I'm going to talk more about thinking about builds and how you go about that, and then of course picking ideal skills to fit those builds. But first, let's talk about the captain. So typically speaking, at the lower tiers, when you first get a chance to get a captain, you probably go ahead and are given an option that give you something like this. You either get a no-point captain for free, you get a 1-point captain for 10,000 credits, or you get a 3-point captain for 25 doubloons. Now, if you're a free player and you have no doubloons, then at the lower tiers, I would say either the 1-point or the free captains are fine. And the reason for that is, generally speaking, at the lower tiers, you get through them pretty fast and you don't really get much in terms of experience. And of course, when you do get some experience, when you move them over to the next ship down the line, you have to retrain the captain, and overall, by the time you retrain the captain, you probably are going to be moving up another tier. So typically speaking, the first time you really are going to need captains with skills that you can actually level up would probably be around tier 5. So starting around tier 5, that's when you should actually consider getting captains with skills. So ideally, if possible, if you have some doubloons to spend, you might want to get a 3-point captain to start, although if you don't, a 1-point captain is good as well. So then of course, you are going to be starting to level a captain at tier 5. Now, when you finish grinding the tier 5 ship and you move up to tier 6, make sure you transfer the captain over. So how you do that is, let me first get a captain. That was a mistake. Alright, so let's say I have a captain. And I've leveled a couple of skills while I'm at tier 5. So what happens after tier 5 is you got to move to tier 6, so you want to transfer the captain over. When you transfer the captain over, you're given a couple of options, and that's the retraining options. You either pay 500 doubloons, 200,000 credits, or you do it for free. 500 doubloons, of course, is instantaneous retraining. 200,000 credits, it's 50% retraining, and free is 0% retraining, so you have to fully retrain the entire necessary experience bar that's shown. Now, around tier 5, tier 6, even tier 7, the 200,000 credit retraining is actually okay, as at that tier, the experience requirement to retrain it is not that great yet. So at the beginning, you can definitely consider the 200,000 credit retraining option. While you're retraining the captain as well, even though your captain isn't fully retrained, it doesn't mean that your captain's skills do absolutely nothing. In fact, if you take a look at your captain's skills while they're in the retraining phase, actually, let me quickly pick some skills here to show you. What you actually will see is that your skills are 50% effective. So you will still gain some of the benefit. So as you can see there, it's minus 50% effectiveness. So you're still going to get a little bit of the benefit, but not all of it. Again, at tier 5, 6, 7, that's actually okay. It's tolerable. However, once you get beyond that and you start to go tier 8, tier 9, tier 10, 50% is not that great. Now, once of course you get up to tier 8, tier 9, tier 10, you really want to start considering using doubloons to retrain your captain, because at this tier, the experience requirements to retrain generally tend to be a little bit more steep. And trying to just sit there and grind all that experience with a 50% effectiveness captain is not all that great. So this is the time that you probably want to be considering starting to invest some doubloons, and the doubloon investment is very, very much worth it. Alternatively speaking, let's say you are a free-to-play player, and you can tolerate the grind, then use the credit option. Alternatively, aside from using doubloons, you could also use premium ships, in case you've bought that and haven't actually bought any additional doubloons. Premium ships can work as well, so you start the retraining and then you move it onto the premium ship. Premium ships don't suffer any penalties, so your skills can be used to 100% effectiveness while you are retraining the skills. And finally, I gotta answer one more question. Well, why carry over your captains? Why not just start up a brand new captain every time you get a new ship? Well, it's because you really, really, really need those skills that you're building up as you're grinding through the previous ships. As you get to the higher and higher tiers, you need as many captain skills as you can, because they're really going to help improve the performance of that ship that you're playing. So that is something that you have to keep in mind, that you really do have to keep rolling the captain over to every new tier, and then keep retraining them and retraining them and retraining them. And hopefully by the time you get up to tier 10, you'll have the captains with at least 15 points so you can get some of the essential skills. Alright, so let's talk about skills. Now, in this version of the video, I'm going to talk about skills a little bit differently than I've done in the past. Mostly because in the past I used to say, well, here's a ship, take these skills. And of course with changes to skills and things like that, a lot of the guides would just become somewhat irrelevant. It's more important that I teach you how to think about which skills to go for based on your ship. So let's use gunboat destroyers on the Russian line as an example. Take a look at the strengths and weaknesses of your ship first. So the Russian destroyers, great guns, good arcs, range is okay usually. The ships are nice and fast, so they can get from point A to point B quickly. And their weaknesses, of course, are, well, they're not very stealthy, so pretty much every other destroyer is going to beat you there. And in terms of maneuverability, they're not all that great. Their turning radius and their rudder shift generally are worse than other destroyers. Okay, so think about the playstyle of your ship. You're most likely going to stay sort of second line supporting destroyer. You're going to mostly try to stay in excess of 10 kilometers away from enemy ships. And then you're going to pummel them into submission with your guns, trying to stay out of trouble as much as you can with some mild maneuvering. So if that's the kind of scenario, what kinds of buffs are you going to be looking for? Well, you're most likely going to look for things that will buff the guns so that you can do more damage. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that your torpedoes are also not very good, so until you first get to tier 9 and 10. So, you know, guns are going to be your main weapon. So, right? So if you go back to skills, you're going to be looking for things that buff your guns. You're probably going to look for some skills that will help you in terms of not getting crippled. Your speed is one of your main advantages, so you don't want to all of a sudden get crippled. You want to be able to continue to zip around the map. You want to be able to utilize smoke to your advantage to stay concealed while you're firing at enemy ships. So with these kinds of criteria, look at the skills that will help your ship. On the first row, the most useful skill is going to be basic firing training. Everything else is not all that useful. Why is basic firing training useful? Because it decreases the reload time of your main guns, increasing your DPM. Everything else like expert loader, not useful because it's a reduction to reload time when your shell type is being switched after your guns are already loaded. Well, you might as well fire your salvo, especially with the basic firing training. Your reload time is pretty short anyways. Basic survivability, not useful, and of course forget aircraft, you have none anyways. So basic firing training is definitely going to be your first skill. Alright, so once you've done that, now you go onto the second row and you take a look at all the skills that might fit, and there's only going to be 3 of them really. Either expert marksman, or torpedo armament expertise, or last stand. Well, like I mentioned before, torpedo armament, unless you get to the end tier, is not very useful, so this skill for most Russian gunboat destroyers is not relevant. So kind of brings it down to expert marksman or last stand. Well, expert marksman, yes, your turrets traverse a little bit faster, which can be useful. But then think about your ship, right? You take a hit. I mean, you're definitely going to take some hits. You don't want to take a hit and then become, well, let's say your engine gets damaged and then you become a sitting duck. You don't want to do that in a Russian destroyer. You want to be able to run away when you have to continue maneuvering when you have to, even while you're taking fire. So out of expert marksman or last stand, I think last stand would actually be the more useful skill. Once you get past that, you get onto the third row. Again, take a look at the third row skills. You have torpedo acceleration. Again, torpedoes not that useful, so you can skip on that. High alert. Well, I mean, you already have last stand that's going to cover your weaknesses when it comes to your engine and steering getting knocked out, so this damage control, party consumable reduction, and reload time, not that useful. So high alert you can probably skip. Vigilance could be useful because your ship isn't all that maneuverable, so against torpedoes you could probably use some help, you know, with early detection and such. But when you think about where you're supposed to play in a Russian destroyer, which is in excess of 10 kilometers away, torpedoes might not be as big of a threat, so maybe not that useful. Aircraft skills you can skip again. Take a look at Superintendent and you can say, well, you get an extra charge of smoke and you get an extra charge of speed boost. Now, the point of playing the Tashkent is to zip around or actually any Russian destroyer, zip around, and when necessary, pop smoke, hide within it, and spam shells. So out of the third row, the most useful skill will probably be Superintendent. Fourth row, and again, you're looking for skills that either help you with zipping around and staying mobile, and of course doing damage. And really, you're only going to see 2 skills that are mostly worth it, and 1 skill that can be worth it at times. The 2 skills that I definitely want to consider would probably be things that will increase my fire chance, in this case Demo Expert, or something that will increase the range of my gun so I can keep firing at things from longer ranges, which would be Advanced Firing Training. So these 2 are the main skills that, for a Russian gunboat, are essential to get. So I would say Demo Expert, AFT. Other skills you can consider are things like Survivability Expert, especially at the higher tiers. A bit more HP to use, and to resist damage is going to keep you in the game longer. However, personally, I would rather just stay at further ranges, not get hit as much, and just set more fires for additional damage. So for me, Demo, AFT all the way. Other skills, not useful at all. Now, that covers your first 14 skill points. You still have 4 more skill points to use. So with the remaining 4 skill points, think back to the skills that were considered somewhat useful. You could get things like Vigilance, right? To commit 3 points to Vigilance, that could be useful. You could spend 2 points on Expert Marksman, and if you do that, if you spend 2 points there, you have 2 extra points. So look for the next most useful skills. So that would be Torpedo Armament Expertise, especially because when you're approaching 18 skills, you're probably at tier 10. So at tier 10, the torpedoes are usable, so you'd want to consider getting that. But I would say with your next 4 points, you'd probably want to invest in things like Expert Marksman, which help your turrets, or Torpedo Armament Expertise. You could, of course, opt for something like Vigilance and maybe Expert Loader if you really feel like you need that reduction in time switching shells, but in most cases you're just better firing it off. Or you could consider basics of survivability, but it's not that useful considering destroyer damage control kits tend to recover pretty quickly. Now let's move on to a battleship as an example. So let's use the Iowa as the example because she's awesome and iconic, and why not? So first 15 skills on an Iowa. First, analyze the strengths and weaknesses and playstyle of the ship. So the Iowa is a very, very, very fast ship. She's got very, very good AA, and her guns are pretty good now. So those are her strengths. In terms of things that she's average at, her secondaries are average, I would say, compared to some of the other battleships that have come into the game now. Secondaries are not bad, mind you. They're just average. And her weaknesses. She's a very, very long ship, so turning radius is pretty big, and her rudder isn't all that responsive. Concealment-wise, she's alright. She's a battleship, so still easy to spot. And her torpedo defense tends to be pretty weak. So what is the Iowa's ideal role? Well, it means she's fast, so she's good for keeping up with task forces, especially ones made up of cruisers and destroyers. She can keep pace with them, so that's important. She can provide them with AA cover, so that's a good thing. And of course, when she does surprise people, especially when they're on the broadside, you can nuke them with your guns. So take a look at skills that fit. I mean, there's generally a couple of builds that I think the Iowa would fit. You could go an AA build to maximize the AA power that you have. You can go with a secondary build, although that's not as recommended. You could go with a sneaking build, so a stealth Iowa, just surprise people and absolutely hurt them. Or you could do things like a tanky Iowa. An Iowa to actually go out there in front of cruisers and tank damage for them, in which case you really have to be aware that you're going to be absorbing lots of HE, have lots of fire set, etc. So there's different pathways here. If you're thinking about an AA setup to maximize your AA, you could probably go with things like basic firing training, go with advanced firing training, and those 2 skills are probably going to be essential. Secondary build, you probably want to go with those 2, as well as the manual fire control for secondary armament. Now you might wonder why during AA I did not say the manual AA control, because this only affects guns of the larger caliber, above 85 millimeters, and for the Iowa, a lot of the AA firepower is concentrated in 40mm guns, so it's not really going to benefit all too much from this. So let's say you're going with another build. Let's say a stealth build. Well, stealth build, you're still probably going to be benefiting from AA. So again, you're probably going to want to go basic fire and training, advanced fire and training, and then concealment. So the AA build could go A and concealment. If you're going with the tanky build, now tanky build for the first 15 skills, you're probably going to get things like basics of survivability. You're probably going to get things like high alert, and you're probably going to consider things like jack of all trades. So with that, you're going to be able to do damage control faster, reducing time that you're on fire, generally tank a little bit better. Then there are also skills that would sort of slot in as substitutes. So for example, you could run an AA setup where the AA skill that you focus on is advanced firing training and basic survivability instead of BFT in order to reduce how much time you spend on fire. So that's something you could consider. In terms of the tanking build, instead of high alert, you could go with something like basics of survivability, superintendent, and then go jack of all trades. So there are all these varieties of skills that you can think about for different purposes. And of course, they have to sort of fit your playstyle. Now, if I look at my playstyle for the Iowa, I generally like to stay with task forces, stay hidden, stay stealthy, get onto the flanks of somebody and surprise them, and hopefully do some damage. So for me, my priority, and when I finally do pop up, I also do want to try to minimize the time I spend on fire, because the more time I spend on fire, the more everybody sort of shoots at me, and the worse my day is going to become. So how I would scale my Iowa is probably go with basics of survivability first, and then once I am done with basics of survivability, I would probably go for things like expert marksman. And then personally, for my playstyle, which again, like I said, don't like being on fire much, like to be stealthy, so probably not going to take as much damage. So I think for me, more beneficial would be high alert. Although vigilance does make a valid argument there as well, especially, you know, your ship doesn't turn all that well. But if you have support from destroyers and stuff scouting for you, vigilance not as important. So for me, high alert over superintendent even for my Iowa. Once you get past that, now you're on to the fourth row. Fourth row skills, for me, I would say the biggest benefit is probably advanced firing training. The extra 20% A firing range is great, especially because a lot of your A firepower is concentrated in shorter range guns. So definitely offer AFT over probably all the other skills. And then finally, on the fifth row, like I mentioned, I prefer sneaking around. So for my 15 skills, I would go for Concealment Expert and go Stealth Iowa. So that would be the first 15 skills. Once you get past the first 15 skills, you have a few more points. A total of 3 more points to actually spend to an 18-point captain. So here is where you have some choice. You can either go for additional 3-point skill like Superintendent or Vigilance, your call here, or you could do an additional investment in 1 and 2-point skills. For me personally, I actually found better use out of the 3-point skill because, again, the more HP you can recover, the longer you're going to stay in the fight. So I would say save up the 3 points, invest in Superintendent, or of course if you have lots of doubloons and you don't mind just, you know, investing other skills first, you could probably take something like Basic Firing Training and perhaps something like Incoming Fire Alert just to give you advance warning of when shells are coming in from range. Still, in this case, Superintendent all the way. Next up, let's talk about carriers. And carriers right now, sadly, not too much variety in skills, with the one lone exception, I believe, when it comes to Saipan, but I'll get to Saipan in a second. Let's say you're playing a regular carrier, and let's just say you have fighters, you have torpedo bombers, and you have dive bombers. Let's go with that, because yes, I know there's certain US carriers like the Ranger where there's no fighters, so you know that doesn't really make a huge difference though in terms of how you pick skills, especially because you're trying to set up these captains for later tier carriers. Alright, so skill choices quite simple. First row, expert rear gunner. You want your bombers to deal with those pesky catapult fighters? This is a skill to get. Alright, once you've gotten this skill, the next row, also really simple. Get torpedo armament expertise, unless of course you're running the 301 on the Saipan, where you have no torpedo bombers, but generally speaking, just get torpedo armament expertise. If you don't get this skill, the only other really viable skill might be incoming fire alert. So you have a sense and a feeling when somebody might be taking a sniping shot at you from range. It's not a very useful skill otherwise. But, you know, generally speaking, torpedo armament expertise, just because 20% reduction to servicing time of torpedo bombers, why the hell not? Third row. Now this is where things get interesting. For most CVs, I would say either get torpedo acceleration, so your torpedoes are faster and they are able to, well, you can lead them a little bit more and they will close in on their targets a little bit faster. Do keep in mind that using the skill on your torpedo bombers does require your torpedo bombers to drop a little bit further back. It does increase the arming distance. So for most CVs, torpedo acceleration, quite helpful. US torpedo bombers, however, you might not want to get this, in which case you could offer something like high alert. Superintendent, not super useful, especially because CV sniping is quite rare at the higher tiers these days, and when you get from tier 8 and above, if you just use a premium defensive fire consumable, you have 2 charges anyway, so most CVs aren't generally going to come after you. The skill, of course, that everybody sort of wonders about is Dogfighting Expert, and Dogfighting Expert is not useful these days pretty much at all unless you get into imbalanced matches where your tier 6 planes run to tier 8 planes. But generally in a one-on-one scenario, not useful at all. The one exception to the rule is Saipan. Let's say you're running a Hiryu and you're using tier 7 fighters and you run up against the Saipan that's running tier 9 fighters. Dogfighting Expert on a Hiryu will absolutely kick the Saipan's fighters' butt because you will get a huge boost to your DPS. So in that situation, Dogfighting Expert is actually useful. Let's say you just want to do nothing but play tier 7 Hiryu forever. So then go ahead, get the skill. It's going to be useful against Saipans that you run into. However, in most cases, torpedo acceleration probably the more useful skill. For me, in a US CV, like let's say the Ranger, where maybe torpedo acceleration not my thing, might go for high alert. But I like torpedo acceleration, so I'm going to go for that. Once you get past that, the remaining 2 skills are totally no-brainers right now because they just offer huge, I guess, advantages to you, the CV player. One, of course, Aircraft Servicing Expert, and the other, of course, Air Supremacy. So no-brainers there with those 2 skills. And let me just get that and that. There we go. So that's your first 15. And once you get past these 15 skills, you have 3 more points. And 3 more points you can invest in things like basic firing training and basics of survivability, just to keep your ship burning less, and of course, giving your A just a slight boost. You could opt for Superintendent with 3 points, or you could opt for High Alert. Now, for me, again, like I said, if you use premium defensive fire at the higher tiers, Superintendent not that useful, so maybe High Alert. Unless, of course, you dedicate a Hiryu player, then just go ahead and get Dogfighting Expert. So much more useful, right? Especially when you're dealing with Saipans. So, you know, in most cases, if you're dealing with higher tier stuff, so tier 8, 9, 10, you'd probably want to get High Alert. Probably the more useful out of all the skills for higher tier CVs. And finally, let's take a look at a cruiser. Let's use the Ibuki as an example. Now, if you know anything about cruisers, they're generally not great at dealing with battleships. So battleship shells, not really all that much fun. So you can't sail in straight lines, you can't use your armor to really tank. You're mostly going to have to depend on dodging and throwing off shots of the opponent. So that's one thing to keep in mind. In terms of our guns, well, in the Ibuki's case, pretty standard reload. Turret traverse not that great, so the need to turn and then at the same time have your guns keep track may be hard to do if you don't have the skills, so might want to consider that. But you do have really, really good fire chance, so set lots of fires, do lots of damage that way. Range is also pretty good on the Ibuki, 19.2 kilometers when outfitted with the correct mods, so long range fire spammer might be a pretty viable idea. It does have torpedoes, and they're 10 kilometer torpedoes that do good damage, so torpedoes are viable secondary armament. But again, when you're at tier 9, you're mostly going to be trying to stay at range and using your guns. Although with Japanese cruisers especially, you do have to know when to use your torpedoes. So that's really, really important. Her AA guns, oh, not very good. a couple of these larger 100mm guns, but most of them are smaller caliber guns. Her A is pretty weak, so you're definitely going to have to stay with other people, and of course defensive fire might really be necessary to save you. She is a fast cruiser, 35 knots, turning circle radius 770 meters, not too bad. Rudder shift time 5.8 seconds when fully upgraded is pretty decent. Concealment 11.3 kilometers with the modules. That's not bad. So what can we do to make the ship better with skills? Ideally, she seems suited to do the long-range fire spam role or the mid-range fire spam role with some maneuvering there. She's not going to be good for tanking hits, so you really don't want to be focusing anything on really buffing her survivability. So if you look at the skills, what you're probably going to do is find things that will buff maybe the A little bit just to try to shoot down a few more planes. So probably basic firing training is the first skill you get. Once you get past that, on the second row, you're probably going to go for expert marksman, although you could make an argument for incoming fire alert just to know when battleships are going to be shooting at you. Personally though, for the whole maneuvering and shooting thing, I prefer expert marksman. On the third row, you have a couple of selections. Torpedo acceleration, if you only intend to use torpedoes up close, although there's a much better skill to get instead of that. High alert, if you don't like being on fire, but again, you're a cruiser, so maybe not as useful as compared to if you're on a battleship. Vigilance could be useful, but with a reasonably fast rudder shift, torpedoes, as long as you keep maneuvering and adjusting course, torpedoes aren't as big of a threat, so vigilance you can probably pass on in the initial 15 points. I would actually recommend getting superintendent because extra heal charge is great, additional defensive fire charges, additional scout plane charges. That I think there's a lot of benefits for superintendent. So get that. On the fourth row, well, fourth row skills, demo expert. Burn everything. Unless, of course, you happen to be in a class of ship where your HE might not be super strong, in which case you might want to opt for advanced firing training. So thinking about German cruisers, maybe. But on a Japanese cruiser, in this case, demo expert all the way, because additional fire chance, why the heck not? And then finally, fifth row skills, I would say concealment expert. For the Japanese cruisers, especially being stealthy, so that people don't actually get a chance to shoot at you, don't have the opportunity to shoot at you, really, really important. And finally, you have 3 more points. And 3 more points, again, you can invest it into one of the other 3-point skills. And that's really up to your preference. Or you can opt for things like incoming fire alert, along with basics of survivability. I have people who absolutely swear that incoming fire alert is a skill that saves them when they're in cruisers. So definitely something you can consider. Anyways, folks, that pretty much wraps up this Captain's Academy video on Captain's skill builds. Again, try to analyze your ship. Try to think about your ship's strengths, weaknesses, and things that you can maybe compensate using either modules or captain skills or a combination of the two. Really, really think about the way your ship should be played to their strengths and analyze your own playstyle as well. Maybe make adjustments there and then of course build accordingly. So, if you do all those things correctly, even though there might be changes to skills in the future and they might wholesale change everything, you should still be able to contemplate how to think about your ship and builds that suit it. Anyways, folks, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Hope it was helpful. If you have any questions, do leave those in the comment section below. Aside from all that, take care, have a good one, and I'll talk to all of you again soon.